It all started with a letter slipped quietly into my mailbox. No name, no signature. Just a neatly folded piece of paper that would change everything I thought I knew about peace, community, and trust. The handwriting was cold, deliberate, almost surgical in its precision. You are in violation of HOA regulations. Immediate action is required. That was it. No explanation, no warning, just a threat wrapped in polite formality. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. After all, I had lived here for years, paid my dues, maintained my home, and followed every rule in the book. But deep down, something about that note felt different, personal, even sinister. Days turned into weeks, and the tension began to thicken like fog over the cul-de-sac. Neighbors I once waved to started avoiding eye contact. Conversations that used to echo with laughter now ended with awkward silence. And somewhere behind those perfect lawns and freshly painted fences, I could feel eyes watching, judging. Then came the meetings, the whispers, the anonymous complaints. Each one a small cut that slowly bled away the calm I once felt in my own home. They said it wasn't personal. They said it was just the rules. But rules don't leave threatening notes on your doorstep. Rules don't move your boundary markers overnight. Rules don't send people to take pictures of your house while you're asleep. No, this wasn't about rules. This was about power, control disguised as community, and yet, every time I thought about fighting back, a new warning arrived. A fine, a letter, a reminder of who was really in charge. Until one day I found something they didn't expect. Proof. Proof that would shatter the perfect image this neighborhood worked so hard to protect. But the real question wasn't whether I could win. It was how far they'd go to stop me. How much destruction would they bring just to protect their illusion of order? Because in this neighborhood, the war wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought with signatures, silence, and fear. So tell me, what would you do when the people meant to protect your home become the ones trying to take it away? The neighborhood of Willow Creek was the kind of place that seemed to belong on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Perfectly trimmed hedges, framed streets so clean you could almost see your reflection in the asphalt. Every morning, sprinklers whispered across emerald lawns, and the faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air, carried by the slow, lazy breeze that moved through the trees. The houses were nearly identical, large, bright, and immaculately kept, with symmetrical windows and crisp white fences that gave the illusion of order, peace, and unity. From the outside, it looked like the dream. A community built on harmony, security, and shared pride. Children rode their bikes in quiet loops, retirees tended to flowers that seemed to bloom in perfect sync, and everyone, it seemed, knew everyone else's business. But beneath the calm surface, Willow Creek was alive with whispers, soft, calculated murmurs that carried through open windows and drifted across driveways. The HOA board ruled it all like a quiet monarchy, cloaked in smiles and courtesy. At the head of it sat Barbara Kent, an elegant woman in her late 50s with pearl earrings, neatly styled blonde hair, and a voice that could turn from sugar to steel in a heartbeat. She called herself a community guardian, but everyone knew she was more of a gatekeeper. The kind of person who remembered every infraction ever made, every missed fee, every late trash pickup, every mailbox painted a shade too bright. Her closest ally, Richard Coleman, was a man who carried authority like armor. A retired police officer with a rigid sense of order, he patrolled the neighborhood even when he didn't need to, scanning for violations with an almost predatory calm. And then there was Monica, the board's secretary, a middle-aged woman with restless eyes and a habit of gossiping under the guise of community updates. Together, they formed the quiet power trio of Willow Creek's HOA. Their meetings were held every other Thursday at the community clubhouse, a pristine white building overlooking the small artificial lake that reflected the sunset in perfect stillness. On the surface, these meetings seemed harmless, polite discussions about landscaping budgets, pool hours, and seasonal decorations. But to those who paid attention, there was an undercurrent, a sense that these weren't just neighbors volunteering their time, but rulers quietly drawing lines, setting boundaries, and deciding who belonged and who didn't. For most residents, It was easier to comply than to question. The rules were the rules. Keep your fence painted, your lawn cut to regulation length, your trash bins hidden. Smile when you pass Barbara, nod politely to Richard, and pretend not to notice when Monica's gaze lingers too long on your front porch. But for me, it wasn't that simple. When I moved into Willow Creek, I was looking for a fresh start. After years of renting small apartments in crowded cities, the house on Sycamore Lane felt like peace. A 2-story craftsman with soft gray siding, a wide porch, and a maple tree that reached protectively over the roof. I had saved for years to afford it. Every late night, every extra shift, every sacrifice funneled into the dream of owning a place that was truly mine. The first few months were idyllic. I spent mornings sipping coffee on the porch, watching the light spill over the quiet street. The neighbors smiled, introduced themselves, and offered cookies or invitations to weekend barbecues. It all felt genuine, warm even. I remember thinking I'd finally found it. A place where people cared about their homes, their community, and each other. But then came the first letter. It was subtle, an envelope from the HOA, addressed neatly to resident of 417 Sycamore Lane. Inside was a polite notice reminding me to remove a non-compliant item from my front yard. The item in question, a handmade wooden birdhouse that hung from the branch of my maple tree. I had built it myself one rainy weekend, carved with small details and painted sky blue. To me, it was a small piece of warmth in an otherwise uniform neighborhood. But to the HOA, it was an unauthorized structure that disrupted community aesthetic harmony. At first, I laughed. It seemed absurd, almost comical. But when I didn't remove it immediately, a fine appeared on my next monthly statement, $50, then $100. I took it down eventually, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want trouble. Yet something about the way the letters kept coming, the tone of them, so impersonal, so absolute, began to gnaw at me. A few weeks later, I noticed Richard's SUV parked across from my house more often. Sometimes he'd sit there for a few minutes before driving off, no explanation, no wave. The first few times, I told myself it was coincidence. Then one evening, I saw him standing on the sidewalk with a clipboard, jotting something down, while staring directly at my yard. When I opened the door to ask if something was wrong, he smiled faintly and said, "Just keeping things in order." It was then I realized how fragile the illusion of peace really was. At the next HOA meeting, I decided to attend, not to argue, but just to understand. The clubhouse smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Folding chairs were lined neatly in rows, and Barbara sat at the front behind a small table, flanked by Richard and Monica. Her smile was perfect, practiced, and chillingly empty. "Welcome," she said when I walked in, her tone polite but cold. "It's always nice to see homeowners take an interest." The meeting itself was uneventful, budget approvals, pool maintenance, minor landscaping complaints, but the atmosphere felt off. Every comment Barbara made was followed by Richard's approving nod, and Monica's pen clicked rhythmically, like a metronome, marking the tension in the room. When I asked about the birdhouse policy, Barbara's smile didn't falter. "We maintain community standards," she said smoothly. "Individual creativity is appreciated, so long as it aligns with our guidelines." The word "our" lingered like a shadow. After the meeting, as people filtered out, I overheard snippets of conversation that made my stomach tighten. "Did you hear about the fence issue on Birch Drive?" Someone whispered, "They're finding her daily now." Another voice replied, "Well, she should have known better." You don't argue with the board. It became clear that everyone in Willow Creek understood the unspoken rule. Compliance wasn't just expected, it was survival. The HOA wasn't just a group of volunteers. It was the silent authority that kept everything spotless and everyone afraid. Still, I tried to adapt. I trimmed the bushes exactly as instructed, repainted the shutters to meet color standards, and attended meetings without comment. I wanted peace, not conflict. But trouble doesn't always come from disobedience. It sometimes comes from simply being noticed. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw a new notice taped to my front door. This time, it wasn't about the yard. It was about my mailbox. According to the letter, it was slightly off standard height. I measured it twice. It wasn't. But when I tried to reason with the board, Barbara simply smiled and said, "Measurements can be subjective. The absurdity of it all would have been laughable if it didn't feel so personal." It was as if someone had decided I was a problem to be corrected. Each letter, each fine, each subtle slight began to feel like a message. "You don't belong here." And then came the whispers. Small things overheard at the community pool or while walking past the park. "He's difficult, doesn't follow the rules. Probably one of those people who think they're above the system." It was strange how quickly politeness could curdle into suspicion. The final straw came the day I found footprints in my backyard, muddy, deliberate prints leading up to my back window. There was no break-in, no damage, but the message was clear. Someone had been there, watching, checking, making sure I understood my place. That night, as I sat in the dim glow of my living room, I realized how quiet the neighborhood truly was. The kind of quiet that didn't bring peace, but pressure, the weight of eyes that never looked directly at you, yet never stopped watching. I remember glancing at the framed letter I kept on my desk, the one that confirmed my ownership of the house. My name, my property, but in that moment, it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like theirs. Every brick, every blade of grass, every ounce of control I thought I had was slipping, one policy reminder at a time. Still, there was something in me that refused to break. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the simple fact that I had worked too hard to hand my peace over to people who saw control as kindness. So, when the next letter came, another fine, this time for unapproved window curtains. I didn't just file it away like the others. I looked at it differently. The font, the phrasing, the signature line, it all felt too deliberate, too manufactured. Something didn't add up. That's when I decided to start looking closer, to attend every meeting, to read every bylaw, every record, every policy they claimed to uphold. Because something told me the real problem in Willow Creek wasn't my mailbox, my yard, or my curtains. It was something much deeper, something hidden beneath the polished surface of perfection this community fought so hard to protect. And the moment I started digging, I realized just how far they were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. The first letter appeared one crisp morning, tucked neatly beneath the welcome mat as if someone wanted me to find it the moment I opened the door. At first glance, it seemed harmless, official, even elegant. The HOA's gold-embossed logo glinted proudly at the top of the page, but the words beneath it cut deep, polite but poisonous. It said, "My mailbox, the same one that had stood there for a decade, was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. They demanded I replace it within 10 days or face a $250 fine." I laughed it off, thinking it must be some clerical mistake. After all, my mailbox wasn't new, but it wasn't broken either. Still, there was something about the tone that didn't sit right. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning dressed as formality. Days later, a second notice came. This time about my grass, height exceeding 2.5 inches. It arrived even though I had just mowed the lawn the previous evening. I stood there holding that paper, staring across the street where Mrs. Larkin's yard looked like a jungle. No letters for her, just me. It wasn't random, I could feel it. Something had shifted ever since I attended that first HOA meeting and questioned where the neighborhood funds were going. They'd smiled through gritted teeth back then, pretending to appreciate my curiosity. Now it was clear that I had painted a target on my back. The letters kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. One accused me of unauthorized garden decor. Another said my garbage bins were visible for 5 minutes longer than permitted after pickup. It was endless. Every envelope felt heavier, carrying not just threats of fines, but a quiet reminder. They were watching. Soon, the watching became real. I began noticing a black SUV idling by the corner late at night, its lights off, but engine humming. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a neighbor's teenager parked for privacy. But when I saw the same SUV parked in front of my driveway the next morning, and again 2 days later, the pattern was undeniable. Someone wanted me unsettled. At the next HO meeting, I decided to speak up. The board sat in their usual half-circle of smug composure, 5 members who seemed to enjoy the illusion of authority more than the responsibility it carried. At the center sat Linda Hayes, the president. Sharp blazer, perfect posture, and the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She called the meeting to order, her voice polished but cold. I waited until the public comment portion before I stood up. "I've received 8 violation letters in 2 weeks," I said evenly, most of them completely baseless. Linda looked at me as though I'd interrupted a sermon. "If you've been fined, Mr. Cole, it's because you've failed to maintain community standards. We apply the same rules to everyone." "That's not true," I said, glancing around at my neighbors, most of whom avoided eye contact. "You're targeting me because I asked where our HOA dues are going." A few heads turned. Linda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she straightened in her chair. "We don't tolerate baseless accusations. If you have concerns, you're welcome to file them properly through the board's review process." I almost laughed. The review process was a labyrinth. Forms, fees, waiting periods, and arbitrary rejections. It was designed to exhaust anyone who tried. I knew then that they weren't just enforcing rules. They were asserting control. The meeting ended with polite applause, but I could feel the tension radiating. As I left, one board member, Mark, a heavy-set man who oversaw community enforcement, leaned in and whispered, "You're making this harder on yourself than it needs to be." From that moment on, the harassment escalated. They fined me for leaving my porch light on past midnight. They claimed my paint color, approved years ago, was now out of harmony with neighborhood palette revisions. Even the smallest things became ammunition. When a storm blew through and knocked a branch onto my driveway, I got a notice the next morning demanding debris removal within 12 hours. It was relentless. Then came the neighbors. At first, it was small comments, sideways glances, forced smiles, whispers when I passed by. The lady next door, who used to wave every morning, suddenly turned cold. One evening, I found her taking pictures of my front yard. When I asked what she was doing, she said it was for community records. A day later, someone left a printed copy of my supposed infractions taped to my door, complete with photos taken from angles only someone standing on my property could have managed. It wasn't just fines anymore. It was a campaign. They wanted me isolated, frustrated, worn down enough to sell and leave quietly. That's what they did to others before me. I'd heard the stories, people who got tired of the constant pressure, the endless fees, and just walked away. But I wasn't going to be one of them. I started documenting everything, every letter, every encounter, every word. I installed cameras, discreet ones at first, then visible ones when I realized visibility was part of the defense. I wanted them to know I was watching too. One night, just past midnight, I caught something on one of the cameras, 2 figures in hoodies sneaking across my lawn. They pulled up one of the small garden fences I'd installed and snapped it in half before darting away. I replayed the footage 3 times, my stomach churning. I sent it to the HOA's official email with the subject line, "Vandalism Incident." No reply. A week later, I received another notice, this time accusing me of having damaged property in my front yard. It was psychological warfare. They wanted to break me without ever raising their voices. Then came the inspection. Linda herself showed up one morning with 2 board members and a clipboard. She didn't knock. She stood on the lawn, pointing and murmuring notes to her companions. I stepped outside, coffee in hand. "Morning," I said flatly. "Oh, good, you're home," she said with false cheer. "We're conducting a routine property review." "Routine? You didn't notify me? We're allowed under Section 4.3 of the bylaws." She smiled again, that same plastic expression. "We've noticed some concerns about your landscaping choices." "Landscaping choices?" I looked around. "You mean the flower bed?" She tapped her pen. "Those particular flowers, daisies, aren't on the approved list. We have a preferred palette for uniformity." I almost choked. "Uniformity? You're finding me over flowers now?" "It's about maintaining value," she said smoothly. "We wouldn't want one property diminishing the aesthetic of the others." I wanted to tell her how insane it sounded, but I just turned back toward the house. She called after me, "We'll send you a formal notice." And she did. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of letters, printouts, and photos. My home, my sanctuary, had become a battlefield. They wanted control, but more than that, they wanted submission. And somewhere beneath the frustration, something else began to burn, a quiet determination. If they thought they could push me out, they didn't know who they were dealing with. The next morning, I drove to the county office. I wanted to see the original property records myself. What I found there changed everything. The HOA's official boundary map included my home, but it wasn't supposed to. A clerical error, intentional or not, had pulled my property into their jurisdiction 5 years ago. They'd been collecting dues and issuing fines illegally ever since. I didn't say a word about what I'd found. Not yet. Instead, I returned home and started digging deeper. Every document, every email, every meeting record. What I discovered was a pattern, a trail of quiet fraud. They'd been overcharging homeowners, pocketing funds under vague maintenance expenses that never happened. But they'd kept the illusion of legitimacy through intimidation. When I confronted one of the newer board members, a nervous young woman named Emily, her voice trembled. "You don't understand," she said. "Linda has connections. You can't fight her. People who do, things happen." I realized then that I wasn't just up against pettiness, I was up against corruption. That night, a final letter arrived. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten, slipped under my door without an envelope. The message was short. "Stop digging. You'll regret it." My lights flickered twice. Somewhere outside, I heard a car door slam. The SUV again. My hands tightened around the note. For the first time since this all began, I felt fear, real fear. But underneath it, stronger than before, was resolve. I wouldn't back down. I was going to expose them. They had taken peace from my home, twisted community into control, and tried to bury the truth under paperwork and threats. But they'd underestimated how far I was willing to go. The storm was only beginning. And this time, it wouldn't be me who broke first. Would you like me to continue with part 2 of The Rising Action, where everything begins to unravel publicly and the HOA's tactics escalate into full-blown retaliation? By the time everything came to a head, the neighborhood no longer felt like home. It felt like a battlefield dressed up as suburbia. The flowers that once bloomed in perfect symmetry along the sidewalks now seemed to mock the chaos underneath, each petal too bright, too calm, too indifferent to the war raging between one man and a board that had gone too far. The homeowner, who once believed that decency and patience could solve anything, now felt a quiet storm growing inside him. The letters had become threats, the warnings had become punishments, and the smiling faces of the HOA board, those neighbors he'd once waved to every morning, had become masks, hiding arrogance and control. It began with yet another letter. This one thicker than usual, stamped in bold red, "Final notice, property violation, and pending legal action." His heart pounded as he tore it open, his hands trembling. The letter accused him of continued non-compliance regarding his lawn height, unauthorized fence repairs, and unsanctioned modifications to his mailbox, the same mailbox he had painted to match the house years ago before the HOA even cared. The fines had accumulated to a staggering amount, more than his monthly mortgage payment. And below the list of charges written in cold legal language were the words that made his chest tighten. "Failure to remit payment within 10 business days will result in lien proceedings on your property." That was the breaking point, the moment everything snapped. He sat down at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of envelopes, photos, and printouts, every complaint, every email, every absurd demand the HOA had ever sent. For months he had tried to reason, to compromise, to appeal to their sense of fairness. But fairness was never the goal. Power was, and they had pushed him far enough. That night he didn't sleep. He stayed up drafting a letter of his own, not one of compliance, but of confrontation. He combed through the bylaws, line by line, discovering contradictions the board had conveniently ignored. He printed emails where their president had made decisions without a quorum. He highlighted rules applied selectively, a neighbor's unapproved garden gnomes left untouched, while his own minor repairs were fined. When dawn came, his kitchen looked like the command center of someone preparing for war. The next morning, the HOA meeting was packed. The same smug faces lined the table, whispering behind their nameplates. The air was thick with tension and false civility. The president, Mr. Collins, began in his usual tone of patronizing calm, announcing agenda items as if this were just another day in their reign. But when the homeowner raised his hand and stood, the room fell silent. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried a clarity that cut through every polite pretense. He laid down the stack of papers on the table with a heavy thud. Documentation, timestamps, proof. "For months you've harassed me under the guise of community standards," he said, meeting each of their eyes. "But what you've really done is break your own rules." He listed every infraction, not his, but theirs. Unauthorized decisions, improper votes, selective enforcement. He cited the HOA's own bylaws and the state statutes they'd violated. The room shifted uneasily. Some of the audience members, neighbors who'd once kept their distance, leaned forward with dawning interest. For the first time, the balance of power began to tilt. Mr. Collins tried to interrupt, but the homeowner held up a letter, an official notice he'd filed with the county, contesting every fine and reporting the HOA's misconduct. Then he dropped the real bombshell. He had contacted an investigative journalist, someone who specialized in exposing abusive HOAs. Emails had been sent, records shared. The board's private messages, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, revealed their true nature: mocking residents, planning selective enforcement to teach lessons, and manipulating votes to maintain control. The room erupted in whispers. Faces paled. A board member excused herself, her composure cracking. The homeowner could feel the air shifting. For months he had been the target, the isolated one. But now the light was turning on them. That night, word spread faster than wildfire. The community that had once watched from behind curtains was now buzzing with anger. Neighbors came forward with their own stories: petty fines, intimidation, threats of foreclosure. The HOA's carefully built image of authority was beginning to crumble under the weight of collective outrage. But the board wasn't done. They retaliated in the only way they knew how: intimidation. The next morning, he found a notice pinned to his door. "You are in violation of community decorum and harassment policy." It was absurd, almost laughable, but behind the absurdity was menace. Later that day, his mailbox was mysteriously dented. A neighbor reported seeing two board members' cars parked across the street late at night. Fear crept in, not the quiet anxiety of before, but the real fear of retaliation from people who had power and no conscience. Still, he didn't back down. He recorded every encounter, photographed every notice, documented every shadowy move. When the next HOA meeting came, half the neighborhood showed up. Cameras rolled. The journalist he'd contacted sat quietly in the back. The board looked rattled. Their fake smiles stretched thin. The homeowner walked to the front of the room again, calm but resolute. "You've used fear to control people," he said. "But fear only works when people feel alone." Then he turned to the crowd. "We're not alone anymore." Cheers broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Neighbors began speaking up, one after another. A single mother fined for her son's bike being left in the driveway. An elderly couple threatened over their lawn ornaments. A veteran fined for flying his flag without proper approval. Each story piled on like waves, crashing against the board's crumbling wall of authority. The climax came when Mr. Collins stood, red-faced and trembling, shouting that these were lies, that the HOA was the backbone of the community. But his voice was drowned out by a chorus of residents demanding change, demanding his resignation. The journalist stood and announced that the story would air that weekend, a full expose on the abuse of power within the HOA. The cameras caught every moment, the board's stunned silence, the homeowner's quiet vindication, and the applause that filled the room like a storm breaking after a long drought. Within days, the fallout began. Collins resigned for personal reasons. 2 other board members followed. The HOA's attorney announced a review of all prior fines and enforcement actions. The community, once divided by fear, began to rebuild itself, neighbors helping neighbors repaint fences, mow lawns, and mend relationships. But the homeowner didn't feel triumph so much as relief, a deep, exhausted relief. For months the fight had consumed him, but in the end he had reclaimed more than just his property. He had reclaimed his dignity. A few weeks later, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, a neighbor walked by, one who had once avoided eye contact, now stopping to say, "Thank you," he smiled, nodding quietly. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint laughter of children playing down the street. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt alive again, and yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew this victory was fragile. Power once taken doesn't disappear, it hides, waiting for another chance. But for now, peace had returned. The signs that once warned of violations had been taken down. The meetings were open and fair, and the house, his house, stood strong, a quiet symbol of defiance against the tyranny that had tried to break him. He leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the golden light wash over him. "You stood your ground," he whispered to himself, not in pride, but in quiet disbelief that it was finally over. In the distance, the HOA office remained dark, its windows shuttered, and though the battle had scarred him, it had also awakened something powerful, not just in him, but in everyone who had lived under that shadow. A realization that communities don't need rulers. They need people willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The fight for freedom, fairness, and simple peace in a neighborhood might not make headlines every day. But for those who live through it, it changes everything. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions don't start with protests or politics. They start with one person saying, "Enough," and on that quiet evening, with the sun setting over a street that finally felt like home again, that's exactly what he had done. When the storm finally passed, what remained wasn't destruction, it was transformation. The neighborhood, once pristine and uniform like a magazine cover, now carried a strange beauty in its imperfection. Lawns were a little less identical. Fences varied slightly in color, and driveways bore the marks of real life. Bicycles, chalk drawings, flower pots, signs of freedom quietly reclaiming their space. The war with the HOA had left its scars. Yes, but it had also lifted a suffocating weight that no one had dared to name. For years, the residents had lived under an invisible leash, smiling on cue, trimming their grass to regulation height, painting their mailboxes in shades deemed acceptable. But now, after the confrontation that had shattered the board's iron grip, things began to change. Slowly at first, then all at once. It started the morning after the story aired on local television. The news segment played clips from the explosive meeting, the confrontation, the documents, the neighbors speaking up. The title at the bottom of the screen read, "Power, Control, and Corruption in the Suburbs, HOA Gone Rogue." It spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with outrage, sympathy, and disbelief. People from other states shared their own horror stories of HOA overreach. Reporters began calling. The board's reputation, once shielded by polite smiles and legal jargon, began to unravel publicly. Within days, county officials stepped in. An investigation was opened into the HOA's finances and practices. Subpoenas were issued. The same office that once mailed him threats was now receiving formal requests for evidence. The attorney who had once defended the board resigned quietly after internal emails were leaked, messages that revealed collusion, favoritism, and in one shocking case, falsified complaints. The homeowner watched it unfold with quiet disbelief. He hadn't set out to destroy anyone, only to be left alone, to live peacefully in his home. But as the truth came out, he realized that his fight had become something bigger. It wasn't just about a fence or a lawn. It was about power of the kind that creeps into communities under the disguise of order. Neighbors who had once avoided him now crossed the street to shake his hand. Mrs. Parker, from 2 houses down, brought him a pie one afternoon, saying softly, "You did what we were all too afraid to do." The single mother who'd been fined for her son's skateboard, she volunteered to help organize a new neighborhood association, one run by residents, not over them. The veteran with the flag that had sparked controversy hung it proudly again, and this time everyone applauded, But the resolution wasn't just public. It was deeply personal. For months, his home had been a battlefield. Every creak of the mailbox, every envelope in the driveway had carried dread. Now silence returned, real silence, the kind that fills a home with peace, not tension. He repaired the fence himself, this time without worrying about the board's approval. He painted the gate the same deep blue he had always loved, the color they had once called non-compliant. As the brush glided across the wood, it felt symbolic, almost cleansing. Each stroke erased a fragment of fear, replacing it with ownership, with freedom. The legal consequences came slowly, methodically. The state's review committee declared that the HOA had violated multiple statutes governing homeowner associations. Their charter was suspended pending reorganization. Several members of the former board faced civil penalties, some for misuse of funds, others for misconduct. The homeowner received a formal apology from the interim committee, along with restitution for the unjust fines he'd been forced to pay, but more than the money. It was the acknowledgement that mattered, the validation that he hadn't been paranoid or petty, that what had happened to him was real and wrong. That validation rippled through the community like a quiet wave of justice. A few months later, the neighborhood gathered for the first open meeting under the new committee. It was held outdoors in the park that had once been off-limits after 8 p.m. due to HOA rules. This time there were no dress codes, no power suits, just people laughing, sharing food, bringing their children. Someone brought a projector and played the local news segment again, this time as a badge of pride. When the homeowner was asked to speak, he hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strength. But when he looked around at the faces of people who had found their voices because he had refused to be silent, he stood. "I never wanted a fight," he began. "But sometimes standing your ground becomes the only way to protect what's right. Not just your home, your peace, your dignity." Applause erupted. Some clapped for him, others for themselves, for the courage they'd finally found. The neighborhood that had once been divided by fear was now united by resilience. The next months were quiet but meaningful. The new committee established fair policies, ones that protected property values without stripping individuality. They removed absurd rules, like the one regulating the number of garden plants allowed per yard. They banned anonymous complaints, forcing accountability. For the first time in years, the word community meant something again. The homeowner noticed the changes not just in policy, but in spirit. Kids rode bikes freely, without worried glances. Elderly neighbors sat on their porches, chatting past curfew hours that no longer existed. The oppressive silence that once haunted the streets had been replaced by laughter, music, and the natural messiness of life. And through it all, he felt something unexpected. Gratitude, not for what he had endured, but for what it had revealed. That even the most ordinary people, pushed far enough, can spark extraordinary change. One evening he received a letter in the mail. His stomach tightened instinctively, an old reflex, but when he saw the envelope, he smiled. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a stranger, a homeowner in another state who had seen the news story. The letter read, "I watched what you went through. I've been fighting my own HOA for years, and I was ready to give up. But your story reminded me that it's worth standing up, no matter how small the battle seems. Thank you." He folded the letter carefully, setting it on the kitchen counter beside the old stack of HOA notices he'd kept as reminders of how far he'd come. Then he took those old letters, the fines, the threats, the absurd violation reports, and fed them, one by one, into the fireplace. The flames crackled softly, erasing months of fear in glowing orange light. Outside, the world moved on. The new board ran smoothly. The community newsletter featured gardening tips instead of enforcement warnings. The once feared compliance patrol was disbanded entirely. And the neighborhood, the same one that had once been suffocatingly perfect, finally felt alive, imperfect and free. Sometimes he'd catch himself walking to the mailbox with a hint of old tension, expecting another reprimand. But all he found were friendly notes, flyers for local events, or thank-you cards. The mailbox had gone from being a weapon to a symbol of peace. As seasons changed, so did he. The anger that had once driven him mellowed into wisdom. He began writing about his experience, not as revenge, but as a warning and a lesson. He wanted others to know how easily control can disguise itself as order, how silence gives power to bullies in suits with clipboards. His story spread. Podcasts invited him to speak. Online communities reached out. He became, in a strange twist of fate, an advocate for homeowner rights. But he never let it make him bitter. Instead, he carried a quiet belief that even in the smallest corners of suburbia, justice matters. One day, as he stood on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he saw the neighborhood kids playing tag across lawns that no longer had invisible borders. The sound of their laughter echoed down the street, most unregulated, untamed, alive. And he realized something profound. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just laughs. He took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. The fight had changed him, not hardened him, but clarified what mattered most. Not the paint color of a fence, not the conformity of a neighborhood, but the simple right to live without fear. He knew that somewhere out there, other HOAs still operated like dictatorships in miniature. Other homeowners were still fighting their quiet wars. But maybe, just maybe, his story had lit a spark that would help them too. And as the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the newly liberated cul-de-sac, he smiled. This was home. Not because it was perfect, but because it was finally real. He turned to go inside, pausing for one last look at the calm, open street that had once been a battlefield. Then, almost as if speaking to the wind, he asked quietly, not bitterly, but with the weight of everything he'd learned, what's the point of building a perfect neighborhood if it costs you your freedom to live in it? And with that, he closed the door. The story of one man versus the HOA ended not with rage, but with peace, the kind that only comes after you fought for it, earned it, and finally set it free.